Chapter 1. The Sacred Flame of Ruin. Montslebe hung fat and bloated in the starless sky, its leprous green glow spilling through the black canopy of the Drakwald like a sickly lantern held aloft by some corpse-handed god. The forest shivered with 1,000 whispered curses, wind hissing through gnarled boughs and bone-laced branches. Beneath the pale eye of the moon, the glade opened like a wound in the trees, an unnatural clearing of churned mud, tangled roots, and blood-soaked earth. At its center rose the Herdstone. Twisted from blackened rock and ancient bone, the Herdstone pulsed like a heart, each beat sending ripples of corrupted magic through the air. Carvings in the surface shifted when not watched, etched in glyphs that burned with green flame, some bleeding ichor, others spewing smoke that reeked of slaughter and rot. Offerings, skulls, entrails, severed limbs, and the flayed hides of men and elves were draped around it like garlands, writhing as if still alive. The blood-horn Warka Grakmar emerged from the shadows, hooves crunching brittle remains beneath his weight. Towering and broad, his black fur was matted with dried blood and streaked with ritual chalk. His horns curled wide and cruel, carved with the tally marks of his kills, each line etched with obsidian and pain. In one hand he carried his war cleaver, an iron monstrosity dented and caked with gore. In the other, the severed head of a rival he'd taken hours before. Behind him, his warherd followed. A mass of gores and bestigors howled and stomped, slamming weapons against their chests and horns, their breath fogging the cold air like steam from open wounds. Drummers beat at flayed-skin war drums with bone clubs, and brayhorns bellowed their deep, monstrous blasts. The air grew thick with anticipation, fury, and the stench of sweat and filth. Across the clearing, shapes stirred. The rival war-herd of Brayshaw Malgok slithered from the trees, their approach accompanied by the clicking of bone totems and the sizzle of unclean magics. Malgok stood atop a crude platform of corpses, his frame gaunt and cloaked in the stretched skin of a flayed bright wizard, still stitched with runes that bled molten sparks. His eyes glowed with unholy light, and his antlers crackled with green and purple energy. Malgok raised his staff, carved from a stolen treekin's femur, and slammed it down with a thunderous crack. His herd bellowed in response, a chorus of frenzied braying and ululating cries that sent beasts scattering into the dark. "The stone is mine, Grakmar," Malgok hissed, his voice like bone scraping stone. "It spoke to me first. My blood opened its eye. Your claim is dust and dung." Grakmar roared in response, lifting the severed head high before crushing it underhoof. "Words are for maggots, Malgok. I will drown this stone in your blood and birth a doombull from your skull." The warherds erupted in fury, but neither side moved. Not yet. The ritual had to begin. Both leaders approached the stone. Grakmar drew a jagged dagger from his belt, fashioned from the spine of a Bretonnian squire, and dragged it across his palm, black red blood gushing forth. He smeared it across the stone, the glyphs flaring in hunger. Malgok followed, slicing his forearm and letting his tainted blood drip into a mouth-shaped crevice at the base. Then the screaming began. Chosen sacrifices were dragged forward, human captives stripped bare, their eyes wide with terror. Grakmar's bestigors lifted a noblewoman and a priest, both already half-flayed, and pinned them against the Herdstone. With ceremonial precision, Grakmar split them open from throat to groin. The crowd shrieked and roared as intestines steamed in the cold air, and the stone drank greedily. Malgok's rites were less swift. He danced in a circle, flicking drops of acid and blood upon his sacrifices, an elf child and a dwarf blacksmith. The child's scream was short, as Malgok ignited him from within, flesh boiling away in sheets. The dwarf fared worse, his limbs melted into stumps before his beard caught fire, his death scream an echo of hatred. The Herdstone pulsed brighter, its voice a gurgling, croaking mockery of life, rising above the noise. The winds of chaos howled through the clearing, and madness stirred in the hearts of the Beastmen. No longer able to wait, the warherds charged. Grakmar's braying war cry split the air as he surged forward, cleavers swinging wide and brutal. He met Malgok's lead gore, Gornash the Tall, and carved through his chest in a spray of meat and rib. Blood fountained across the battlefield. The Bestigors crashed into Malgok's followers with the fury of stampeding bulls. Horns girt bellies, axes hacked limbs, and the dirt became mud with blood and bile. Malgok screamed a curse and unleashed a spell, vile green fire that rolled across the battlefield, reducing half a dozen gores to melting, shrieking heaps. One tried to flee, his flesh dripping from his bones like wax, only to be trampled by a charging Razorgore. Grakmar slammed into a Bray chieftain, lifting him by the throat and biting deep into his shoulder, tearing away sinew and bone. He hurled the body into a knot of Malgok's ungors, scattering them like chaff. Meanwhile, Malgok chanted louder, summoning a storm of black thorns from the air, which pierced his enemies like needles. One Vestigor stood impaled, still snarling, his body twitching with spasms as blood poured from his eyes and mouth. The battle raged under Morsalip's gaze, a whirlwind of tooth, horn, fire, and steel. Grakmar and Malgok locked eyes across the chaos, each bloodied, each maddened, each ready to claim the sacred flame for their own. The Herdstone pulsed again, brighter now, almost alive. Would not be satisfied until the forest drowned in ruin. Chapter 2. Calmant of the Silver Flame. The wind rolled in from the east, dry and bitter, carrying with it the scent of ash and rot. It whispered through the crags of the borderlands, rustling golden fields and bending the tall grass of forgotten roads. Where once the air had been clean with the scent of wild flowers and the smoke of village hearths, now it stank of decay and old blood. The people spoke, in hushed tones, of beasts in the trees and fire in the night, of screams that echoed through the forest like the baying of 1,000 wolves. In the chapel of Saint Artaud the Resolute, beneath a fresco of the Lady Crowned in Moonlight, knelt Calmant of Dunclair, clad in mail dulled by time and pilgrimage. His tabard, blue and silver with a fleur-de-lis emblazoned across his chest, was tattered at the hem, its cloth stiff with dried blood and the dust of countless roads. His eyes, deep-set and shadowed, stared at the floor as if searching for something that no mortal could see. He had drunk from the Grail only weeks past. The memory of it still seared him from within, liquid light that had burned away all doubt, all pain, all fear. When his lips touched that holy relic, time itself had slowed, and he had stood within a vision of the lady, her form luminous and veiled, her hand outstretched. Her voice was thunder and breeze, silk and sword. A great corruption stirs, my knight. The forest bleeds, the earth screams. Go. Now he rose, taller than before, though not by stature. The peasants who gathered beyond the chapel's doors fell to their knees as he stepped out, sunlight catching on the polished edges of his armor. His eyes shone like molten silver. His sword, once a plain blade of honest steel, now shimmered faintly with a bluish light, the silver flame blessed by the lady herself, a weapon to burn the unclean. Calmant swung into the saddle of his Destria Veritas, a warhorse as white as morning snow and armored in barding etched with holy prayers. A thin mist clung to the borderlands as he rode, and the peasants watched him disappear down the old forest road, the bells of the chapel tolling behind him. The deeper he traveled into the borderland wilds, the more the world sickened. Trees bent unnaturally, twisted by unseen hands. Birds no longer sang, Carcasses of deer and wolves lay gutted along the trails, their bodies torn open as if by claws far too large. The sky above darkened, even though the sun still hung in the heavens. The forest canopy, thick and oppressive, seemed to whisper blasphemies with every breeze. He passed a village that no longer bore a name. Burnt husks of cottages smoldered in silence. Blackened bones jutted from the ruins, some still clutching rusted pitchforks or twisted farm tools. The bodies bore signs of brutal slaughter, limbs hacked crudely, heads smashed into pulps. Blood, long dried, stained the soil like spilled ink. At the edge of the ruins, Calmant dismounted. He knelt before a scorched shrine to the lady, its statue toppled and desecrated, its stone face hacked away. With steady hands, he righted the shattered form, cleaned the base with his tabard, and offered a prayer. As he rose, he heard the sound. A child's scream, thin, sharp, and full of terror, cut through the trees. Calmant drew his sword, and the silver flame flared to life, casting pale light across the darkened woods. He ran, armor clanking, branches slashing at his face, boots thudding against blood-slick earth. The scream echoed again, followed by guttural laughter and the wet crunch of flesh being torn. He broke through into a clearing. There a band of Ungors stood in a semicircle, laughing and jeering. One held a small girl by the arm, her dress torn, her face streaked with mud and tears. Another tore into a goat, gorging itself while blood ran down its bare chest. Calmant gave no warning. He surged forward, blade singing. The first Ungur turned too late. Calmant's sword took it across the neck, and its head tumbled free, spinning through the air in a trail of crimson mist. The body staggered, spurting blood, then collapsed in a twitching heap. The others howled, but the knight was among them before they could rally. He drove his sword through a second creature's gut, the silver flame burning as it seared through flesh and spine. It screamed, clawing at the blade, even as its entrails slid free in ropes of steaming gore. An axe bit into his pauldron, glancing off. Calmant turned, eyes glowing, and smashed his mailed fist into the Ungor's face. Bone shattered with a wet crunch. The creature stumbled back, and Calmant's blade took its leg out from under it. He finished it with a downward thrust that pinned it to the earth like a butcher's skewer. The last squealing into the trees. He did not give chase. The girl stared up at him, frozen in terror. Calmant dropped to one knee, removed his gauntlet, and extended a blood-slicked hand. "You are safe now," he said softly, his voice like warm steel. "The lady watches you." She collapsed into his arms, sobbing. As he carried her back to his horse, he looked to the horizon. Beyond the trees, the sky flickered green and thunder growled like a beast awakening. He would ride deeper still. The forest would burn if it must. The lady had spoken, and Calmant would answer. Chapter 3. Warherd against Warherd. Dawn never came to the clearing that held Malgok's war camp. Morsleep remained hanging like a diseased lantern in the sky, casting the glade in a toxic green half-light. The trees leaned inward unnaturally, warped by dark energies and weighted with bones, blood totems, and twitching carcasses of flayed animals that swung gently with each foul breeze. At the center stood the Herdstone, more massive than before. It throbbed now like a great cyst ready to burst, its surface slick with gore and crawling with runes that changed shape every few seconds. Spells of damnation etched by bloodied claws and inscribed in languages long buried beneath the chaos wastes. Each fresh offering made the air buzz with dark power, as though the gods themselves were watching with amusement. Malgok stood at the top of the stone dais, eyes glowing with unspent sorcery. He wore a crown of antlers stolen from a rival Bray shaman, bound to his skull with sinew and iron nails. With every sacrifice he had fed the Herdstone's hunger and deepened his communion with the gods. His war camp buzzed with activity, Beastmen, sharpening cleavers, chanting in mad tongues, daubing their flesh with dung, blood, and ash. Razogor snorted and stamped in crude pens, their eyes white with fury, tusks slick with slime. Then came the sound. The war horns of Grakmar, deep, thunderous bellows made from hollowed giant bones, shook the forest. Trees shuddered. Birds fell dead from the sky. The camp fell silent for a moment. Then came the drums, savage and rhythmic, and the roars of 1,000 blood-drunk beastmen. Grakmar's war herd descended like a black tide through the trees, weapons raised, howling like the damned. At the front strode Grakmar himself, his cleaver raised high, horns painted with the blood of his own kin, face split in a battle-crazed grin. The first line of Malgok's defenders braced with snarls and brays, but they were not ready. A Razogor, the size of a cart bull, charged forward, armor strapped to its flanks with rusted chain. It slammed into a line of Ungors, tossing them like rag dolls. One screamed as it was impaled on a tusk, writhing like a worm before being crushed underfoot. Gors leapt in to retaliate, but Grakmar's bestiggers hit them in the flank with terrifying force, hacking down with two-handed axes that sheared limbs and split spines. Blood fountained skyward in curtains. Malgok screeched from his perch and raised his staff, conjuring a wind of raw chaos. Purple lightning crackled from the sky, slamming into Grakmar's ranks. A trio of Gors exploded into clouds of pink steam, their skeletons momentarily visible as glowing husks before crumbling into ash. Another was turned inside out in a squelching blast, its organs sucked into the ether. Grakmar howled with rage and stormed through the battlefield, cleaving down friend and foe alike in his bloodlust. His blade met a Bray champion loyal to Malgok, Kargash the Hookhand. Their weapons rang, sparks flying. Grakmar took a blow to the ribs, his armor denting with a crunch. He responded by ramming his horns into Kargash's gut and lifting the screaming beastman into the air before ripping his throat out with his jagged teeth. Meanwhile, the Herdstone began to glow brighter. With each kill it shimmered. Sacrificial pits overflowed. Malgok's Bray shamans gathered around it, their chants frenzied, eyes bleeding black ichor as they poured magic into the cursed rock. The stone drank the chaos greedily, lightning flashing from its peak, scorching the ground and lashing out at the minds of those nearby. Ungors went mad and tore at their own flesh. One Bestigor hacked off his own arms, and roared defiance even as he bled out, grinning through broken fangs. In the eastern flank, Grakmar's minotaurs crashed through a barricade of sharpened stakes. They moved like living, battering rams, muscles slick with gore, jaws unhinged in perpetual hunger. One lifted a screaming Gor into the air and bit its head off with a crack, then beat its corpse against another enemy until both were a pulp of meat and fur. But Malgok was not done. He whispered to the ground. The earth split, and a tide of black serpents with human faces slithered forth, biting into legs and bellies, injecting venom that caused flesh to bubble and slough off in dripping hunks. Gors screamed and flailed as their arms melted to bone, eyes liquefying in their skulls. Grakmar charged through the smoke and death to confront Malgok at the foot of the Herdstone. The ground was wet with blood, slick and steaming. They met with a clash of steel and sorcery. Grakmar's cleaver rang against Malgok's staff, which sparked and screamed like a living thing. The Wargor's brute strength forced Malgok to one knee, but the shaman unleashed a pulse of raw warp energy that hurled Grakmar back into a pillar of skulls. Both rose again, wounded but maddened. Around them their herds tore each other apart, the battlefield a mire of screaming bodies, crushed bones and torn flesh. Above it all, the Herdstone wailed. It cracked at its base, bleeding a thick, dark fluid that steamed upon contact with the soil. Runes split apart. Magic surged outward in waves, distorting the air. A flock of crows flew overhead and burst into flame mid-flight, their charred remains falling like burnt leaves. The Herdstone was no longer merely a relic. He was alive, and it was starving. Chapter 4. The Lady's Vision. The chapel ruins lay in eerie silence, shrouded in the gray mist of early dawn. Only the broken whispers of the wind stirred through the remnants of stone pillars and crumbled archways, where once proud banners of the lady had flown. Now they were gone, burned or torn away, leaving only scorched walls and shattered glass. Ash coated the ground like a burial shroud. Calmant knelt alone beneath the charred remains of the altar. His armor was streaked with dried blood and flecked with soot, the silver flame of his sword resting across his thighs, pulsing faintly. He bowed his head, breathing deeply, his gauntleted hands clasped in prayer. The lady came in silence. She did not speak in words. She did not need to. The light came first, moonlight, soft and silver, spilling through the cracks of the ruined chapel even though the sky remained overcast. A warmth spread across Calmant's chest, as if his heart itself had caught fire. Then came the vision. Not a dream, but a memory of the future, seen with the soul rather than the eyes. He stood in a forest of screaming trees, twisted and blackened, their roots writhing like serpents. Beneath them, a stone pulsed, taller than a man, built of bone and obsidian, carved with runes that wept blood and breathed smoke. Beastmen circled it in endless howling rituals, their bodies drenched in the entrails of the sacrificed. The ground cracked, shadows poured forth like ink spilled into water. The stone bled. The forest died. He saw villages swallowed whole, crops withering in days, infants born without faces, the dead walking with hooves, the heavens darkened by flies and smoke, and above it all, the Herdstone, pulsing with power, growing, whispering, feasting. Then her voice, he must be unable. The vision vanished like mist in the sun, and Calmant collapsed forward, breath ragged forehead against the cold stone. His chest heaved as tears cut lines through the ash on his face. He knew what must be done. He roused. By midday, the hamlet of Sainte-Mairie, perched on the edge of the forest like a lone candle before a storm, rang with the sound of hooves and steel. Calmant rode through its gate, face stern, tabard mended, helm tucked beneath one arm. He spoke with clarity, his voice a blade of light cutting through fear and superstition. By the lady's will, the corruption in the woods shall be purged. The Herdstone must be destroyed. The villagers looked on in awe as he called upon the local castellan, and together they summoned a small force, hand-picked knights from the surrounding lands, young and unblooded, eager to prove their valor. Among them rode Sir Lothair de Van, swift and grim, his lance etched with prayers to the lady. To Godric of Avalon, heavy-set and loud, wielding a mace as thick as a child's torso. Lady Isandra, lithe and wrathful, her blade known to sing with fury. They rode with Calmant at the front, their armor polished, their banners newly stitched. Behind them marched 20 men-at-arms, armored in boiled leather and chainmail, bearing halberds, shields, and the haunted eyes of men who had seen too many disappear into the woods and never return. At dusk they gathered at the forest's edge. The Drakwald stood before them like a wall of darkness, the trees reaching skyward like black talons, the air already thick with rot and the low hum of unseen things. Birds did not sing, insects crawled in frantic spirals. The wind reeked of wet fur and sulfur. Calmant dismounted and drove his sword into the ground. It flared with the light of the lady, a beacon in the dark. "This is no simple raid," he said, voice raised to the assembled. "We ride not for glory, not for plunder, but to strike down a blight upon this land, a relic of unclean gods, fed by blood and madness." He paused, eyes fierce. "We do not return unless it is shattered." The knight saluted. The men at arms, some pale, some shaking, nodded and gripped their weapons tighter. With the setting sun casting long, blood-colored shadows behind them, Calmant retrieved his sword, mounted Veritas, and led them into the forest. And behind them, the wind carried the distant sound of drums. War drums. Deep, ancient, and getting louder. Chapter 5. The Siege of Roots. The glade was gone. In its place sprawled a living rot, a forest that pulsed like flesh and oozed like a wound. Maljok's spell had changed everything. The ground no longer crunched beneath hooves or boots, it squelched. Every step sank ankle-deep into pulsing moss the color of bile, riddled with twitching cysts that burst when stepped upon, spilling foul-smelling pus across the roots. The Herdstone had grown grotesquely. No longer a monolith of bone and dark stone, it was now embedded deep within a tumor of bark and blight, its surface fused with the gnarled limbs of trees and the warped organs of something that may once have been a beast or a god. Its veins glowed green and black, throbbing with unnatural life. The air buzzed with swarms of flies, their wings a ceaseless whine of madness. From the stone's crown, smoke billowed in thin ribbons that stank of decay and disease, curling skyward like the breath of a dying titan. Maljok stood at the center, arms outstretched, head tilted back. His body was a ruin of sores and swollen flesh, pustules bursting across his ribs, but his eyes burned with power. Around him, Bray shamans chanted in diseased tongues, clawed hands raised as they fed the corrupted magic with flesh and faith. They bled themselves freely, their blood yellow-green and steaming as it soaked into the living roots that gripped the Herdstone. Behind them, a new warherd of Nurgle-touched beasts formed. Bloated gores with milky eyes and rotting mouths, flail-armed ungers that dribbled black ichor, and lumbering pestilent spawn that crawled from holes torn in the earth. The trees themselves had turned traitor. Boughs creaked with sinister laughter, trunks split to reveal weeping mouths that whispered blasphemies and sang songs of disease. Across the corrupted mire, Grakmar stood with his warherd, muscles taut, nostrils flaring as he took in the abomination before him. He could smell the wrongness, fetid, thick, oily, and it filled him with purest hate. His horns, now daubed with war paint and crusted blood, glistened in the dull light. Behind him the remnants of his herd readied themselves, wounded but unbroken, driven not by faith, but by hunger, fury, and pride. The siege began at dusk. The Grakmal raised his cleaver and bellowed, a guttural roar that echoed across the corrupted grove. His besiegers surged forward with a thunderous clamor, weapons high, hooves tearing through the wet muck as they charged. They met the festering tree line like a crashing wave, slamming into the wall of rotting bark and flesh with splintering force. The trees screamed. Living roots erupted from the ground like spears, impaling beastmen and dragging them down into the soil. One gore was caught around the leg, yanked into the earth so violently that his bones snapped audibly. His screams were brief. Another was swallowed whole by a tree that split open like a jaw and clamped down with grinding teeth of fungus-encrusted wood. Grakmar stormed forward through the carnage, cleaving a path through writhing roots and pestilent limbs. A bloated spawn hurled itself at him, its flesh barely holding to its bones, its eyes leaking mucus. Grakmar met it mid-charge and drove his cleaver down with both hands, splitting it from skull to groin. The corpse erupted in a gout of hot filth, drenching him in acid-stinking slime. Arrows hissed from the corrupted grove, twisted shafts of bone tipped with rot. One embedded itself in a Bestiger's throat. He yanked it out, only for his neck to swell and burst seconds later as flies poured from the wound. Another took a shaft to the belly and dropped to his knees, vomiting up black bile until his lungs emerged. From within the heart of the grove, Maljok watched, Laughing wetly, he raised both arms and spoke a final incantation. The sky turned sick. A plague rain fell, thick droplets that sizzled against armor and flesh alike. Beastmen shrieked as boils bloomed across their hides, fur sloughing off in clumps, muscles turning to jelly. The lucky ones died quickly. The rest crawled, screaming, into the mire, where the roots welcomed them like worms to meat. Drakwald would not yield. He pressed deeper, his war cry raw, weapons soaked in the pus and blood of a dozen foes. He hacked down a trio of plague gores, one of whom exploded in a cloud of infectious gas. He stumbled but rose, coughing blood, his veins darkening beneath his skin. But he would not stop. They reached the outer ring of the Herdstone, where its power throbbed like a living heart. Malgok stood atop it, chanting, his face split in a smile of fevered joy. Drakwald raised his cleaver to challenge him, but the ground betrayed him. A massive root burst forth, striking him across the chest, hurling him into a wall of twisted trees. He roared in pain, ribs shattered, breath ragged. He rose again, one eye swollen shut, blood pouring from his mouth. The siege would not end today, but the battle was not yet lost. Drakwald stared through the rotten ruin at the heart of the blight and vowed he would tear it down. Brick, blood, and bone, even if it killed him. Chapter 6. Lance and Horn. The forest edge rose before them like a monstrous wall, gnarled and weeping. The trees were no longer trees. Their bark was split by veins of pus and bile. Their trunks warped into obscene shapes. Some bore the faces of the dead, stretched and screaming in eternal torment. Vines as thick as a man's thigh twisted together like muscle, pulsating with an inner glow that churned from green to sickly yellow. A stench rolled out in waves, a choking miasma of death, disease, and something worse, something unnatural. Sir Calmont of the Silver Flame reined in Veritas and narrowed his eyes. The knight's jaw tightened beneath his helm, his breath catching in his throat. Around him, the small force he'd led, his shining hope against this festering nightmare, began to falter. Even the knights, clad in blessed steel and bearing the sigils of their noble houses, shifted uneasily in their saddles. Men at arms murmured prayers, knuckles white on spear hafts. One vomited quietly behind a tree, his eyes never leaving the writhing canopy beyond. "This is where the lady sends us," Calmant said, voice steady despite the horror. "This is where we bring her light." He raised his sword, and the silver flame flared like a beacon, casting a pale, purifying glow across the corrupted land. Without further words, the column advanced into the corrupted fringe. The moment the Bretonnians crossed the threshold, the forest reacted. A sudden shriek echoed from the gloom, high-pitched, animal, and full of hate. Shapes moved among the trees, hunched, fast and snarling. Shadows peeled themselves from the underbrush. And then they came. A vanguard of Ungors, filth-caked and howling, burst from the woods. They were malformed, their horns stunted, their eyes glazed with madness. Their weapons were crude, rusted cleavers, hooked knives, jagged sticks. And yet they came with murderous speed, emboldened by the disease-choked forest. Sir Godric of Avalon met the first wave head-on, his mace swinging in wide, bone-making arcs. One Ungor leapt for him and caught a full blow to the chest. Its rib cage crumpled with a wet crack, and it was hurled backwards like a sack of meat. Godric roared, spurring his horse forward, trampling another beastman beneath hooves as thick as paving stones. To his left, Lady Isandra rode low in her saddle, sword flashing. She lopped an Ungor's arm clean off, blood spraying in black arcs. The creature screamed and staggered back, only for her second strike to open its throat with surgical grace. She did not pause. The line of men at arms behind the knights held formation, spears out, shields up. Ongors slammed into them with feral fury, but discipline held. A dozen fell on the initial impact, impaled on Bretonnian spears or hacked down by halberds. Yet more surged forward, climbing over the bodies of their kin, eyes wild with bloodlust. Calmant rode straight into the thick of them. The silver flame cleaved through an Ungor's torso like cloth, its body falling in two steaming halves. Another leapt at his mount, only for Veritas to rear and slam both hooves down on its skull, cracking it like a melon. Calmant swung again, blade glowing brighter with each strike, purging the unclean with every blow. But they were surrounded. The Ungors were endless, shrieking from the trees, crawling through undergrowth, striking from every angle. One managed to drag a man at arms to the ground, biting into his cheek and clawing at his throat before his comrades dragged it off and speared it through the gut. The soldier lay twitching, his face a ruin of teeth marks. Then, through the chaos, came the sound that changed everything. The horns of Grakmar. A monstrous note reverberated through the forest, deep, ancient, and filled with hate. It echoed off the trees like thunder in a tomb. Then came the second, a shrill, mocking bray from Malgok's camp. The Ungors faltered, their heads snapping toward the source of the sounds. Calmant paused mid-strike, eyes narrowing. The warherds had heard the clash, and now they were coming. Grakmar's scouts spotted the glint of Bretonnian steel through the trees and howled with fury. To the Beastman, it was heresy, a sign of weakling men defiling their sacred battleground. Malgok's corrupted shaman sight saw deeper still, a knight of the Grail, radiant as fire, come to undo the work of the gods. Within minutes, both warherds stirred. Montmar's wounded horde emerged from the forest's northern edge, horns low, weapons ready, rage unbroken despite the siege's toll. They moved like stampeding beasts, a wave of muscle and steel and horn. From the west, Malgok's plague-ridden forces oozed forth, shambling, howling, still rooted to the Herdstone, but now mobile enough to lash out, drawn by the scent of new blood and purpose. Calmant looked from one side to the other, blood dripping from his sword, his armor scored and dented. All around him the battlefield churned, woodland churned into marsh, corrupted roots curling around corpses, flies thick in the air. One knight whispered, "We are between monsters." Calmant raised his sword again, its light blazing brighter, his voice ringing like a bell in a storm. "And we fight both." And so began the true battle, not just of steel and fury, but of faith and madness, of light against the blackest rot. The lances of Bretonnia and the horns of the Beastmen would clash in a maelstrom beneath trees that bled and soil that wept. And at its heart, the Herdstone watched, growing, hungering, waiting. Chapter 7. The Tri-Clash. The storm broke over the Drakwald not with rain, but with blood. Lightning, green and purple, tore jagged wounds into the heavens, illuminating the battlefield in strobes of sickly light. The wind screamed like a dying god, blowing the stench of death, rot, and wet iron through the festering grove. Beneath that storm, three armies surged toward each other like beasts loosed from their cages, snarling, braying, shouting war cries that split the sky. The knights of Bretonnia came in perfect formation, their lances lowered, hooves pounding a rhythm of divine wrath. Each was a glinting silver missile of holy fury, tabards snapping in the storm winds, the ladies' fleur-de-lis gleaming through gore and muck. At their head rode Calmant of the silver flame, his sword alight, his eyes fixed upon the corrupted hill that loomed ahead, crowned by the Herdstone, the heart of this nightmare. To their right, Grakmar's warherd thundered into motion, a tide of horned fury. Minotaurs bellowed, swinging tree-trunk axes that sprayed red mist with every impact. Bestigers stampeded with maddened rage, their armor clattering, their horns glistening with dried blood. Grakmar himself led them, his cleaver held high, his one good eye burning with raw hatred. They moved as if possessed, caring not for the Bretonnians, nor for the blight of Malgach. All they saw was the Herdstone, their prize, their god-made stone, and any who stood in their path were already dead. To the left, Malgach's corrupted children writhed from the trees, a living tide of filth and bile. Plague gores shambled forward, dripping with open sores and laughing as their flesh sloughed from bone. The Bray shamans chanted, vomited curses, and raised staves that pulsed with the blessings of Nurgle. One pointed toward the knights and unleashed a stream of pestilence, green flame that slithered through the air like a serpent of sickness, consuming steel and screaming flesh alike. Men burned from the inside out, their armor bursting open as pus and worms spewed from their mouths. Three forces collided. The ground shook with the weight of slaughter. Calmant's knights crashed into Grakmar's front lines like a divine hammer. Lances skewered Gors three at a time, hooves crushed Ungors into the mud, and swords flashed like lightning. Yet Grakmar's horde did not break. They welcomed the pain. They surged around the knights, hacking and goring, dragging men from their saddles and tearing them apart limb by limb. One knight screamed as a minotaur seized him mid-charge and bit off his head with a crutch. Calmant swung his blade in wide arcs, the silver flame carving holy furrows through beast and demon-touched flesh alike. A Bestigor lunged, axe raised, and Calmant met him with a shield slam that shattered bone. He plunged his sword into the creature's belly, twisted, and kicked it free, the corpse sliding into the mud with a splash of steaming blood. But there was no time to breathe. Malgach's sorcerers unleashed hell. A storm of pestilent fire rained down upon both knight and beast alike. Trees screamed as they burned with no flame, only rot. Flesh melted from bone in sticky sheets. One knight tried to pray but vomited blood mid-chant as his organs liquefied and spilled from the seams in his armor. Malgach himself stood atop the Herdstone, arms raised, a conduit for divine filth. From his mouth spilled not words, but flies, thousands of them, his eyes weeping thick green ooze. The Herdstone beneath him pulsed violently, cracks forming along its cursed glyphs. Each fracture released a shockwave of magic, distorting reality, tearing holes in the air. From these wounds in the world, Daemons stirred. Shadows flickered unnaturally across the battlefield, twisting into grotesque forms. Long-limbed things with too many eyes crawled from nothingness, giggling with mouths that didn't match their faces. One such daemon, its form a dripping amalgam of tongues and limbs, wrapped itself around a dying man-at-arms and pulled him screaming into the rift. The earth split open near the Herdstone. A yawning maw tore through soil and root, belching forth a choking fog of despair. Grakmar turned, eyes locked on Calmant. Blood-soaked, wounded, furious, he charged the knight, bull-like legs pounding through the battlefield. Calmant met him atop a rise littered with the bones of men and beasts, a hill of the dead, sacred to none but the slaughtered. They collided with the sound of crashing thunder. Grakmar's cleaver struck first, a downward arc meant to split a horse in half. Calmant parried with both arms, steel screeching against iron, sparks flying. The impact knocked him backward a step, but he held. He struck back, blade flashing, catching Grakmar across the shoulder. Blood, thick and black, sprayed across them both. They fought like avatars of opposing gods, one burning with purity, the other with wrath. Each strike was a hymn, each wound an offering. Grakmar roared and charged again, horns down, impaling Calmant through the side. The knight screamed, blood bubbling from his lips, but did not fall. He drove his sword upward, beneath Grakmar's arm, into the creature's chest. They crashed together again, grappling, snarling, kneeing, punching, stabbing. And, beneath them, the Herdstone cracked wide open. It screamed. not metaphorically, but audibly, a chorus of wailing, sobbing, laughing madness. Its surface shattered into pieces of glowing ruin. Light, not holy, not unholy, but raw, terrible magic poured upward, forming a swirling vortex above. The veil between worlds thinned. The air shimmered. Daemons reached through, clawing, sniffing, giggling, waiting. Calmant shoved Grakmar back with a final surge of strength and fell to one knee, sword planted in the bone-littered hill. Grakmar staggered, blood pouring from his mouth, from his chest, his knees shaking. The battle around them raged. Knights screamed, beastmen brayed, plague fires consumed trees and men alike. Then overhead the vortex widened. The final act had begun. Chapter 8. The Broken Oath. The storm above the Drakwald had become unnatural, its thunder a chorus of screaming mouths, its lightning no longer bolts but jagged tears in the sky, through which things watched. The vortex above the shattered Herdstone had widened into a pulsing wound in the world, a swirling cyclone of raw, corrupted magic. Tendrils of warp light arced downward, snaking into the cracks of the Herdstone like veins feeding a living heart. Atop the broken monument stood Malgok, arms spread wide, robe tattered, drenched in blood and warp energy. His skin had burst in places, revealing not flesh but crawling things, maggots writhing beneath his pelt, eyes embedded in his limbs blinking in unison. His voice was a chant of blasphemy, older than mankind, older than language. He spoke in syllables that cracked the air, each word a blade, each breath a curse. Below him, Bray shamans circled the base, slicing their own flesh, offering themselves to the spell with suicidal devotion. Their blood hissed as it hit the stone, feeding the ritual. The glyphs burned brighter, the cracks in the Herdstone glowing molten red, then flickering to impossible colors, colors that did not belong in this world. Then the ground trembled. The figure staggered toward the base of the stone, cleaver in hand, body broken but not beaten. Grakmar. His armor was in pieces, one horn shattered, his left leg dragging behind him, mangled by warp fire. His once broad chest rose and fell in shallow wheezing breaths, ribs jutting from the skin. He left a trail of black blood behind him, but his one remaining eye blazed with fury. The Bray shamans did not see him at first. They were consumed by the spell, but they had seen him hours before, and then they had betrayed him. It had been during the lull in the slaughter, before the final convergence. Grakmar, bleeding and delirious, had summoned his shamans for guidance, for magic to stave off the corruption crawling into his bones. But instead of chants for healing or strength, they had circled him with fangs bared, chanting the same foul hymn Malgok now screamed into the heavens. They had chosen power, not loyalty, not the herd. He'd fought free, but not unscathed. One had pierced his side with a poisoned bone dagger. Another had unleashed a curse that withered the muscle of his leg. And now they stood here, feeding Malgok's madness, seeking favor from the gods in place of their warlord. Grakmar saw nothing but red. With a bellow that rattled trees, he surged forward, limping, stumbling, but unstoppable. He crashed into the circle, his cleaver taking a shaman in the chest. The body split in half, ribs splayed open like wings. A second tried to run, only to be seized by the throat and slammed into the stone so hard the skull burst like a melon. Blood sprayed over the glyphs. Malgok turned then, eyes wide, mouth stretching into a grin too wide for his face. "Come to witness my apotheosis, old bull," he croaked, voice layered with inhuman echoes. "You were never meant to rule, only to pave the way." Grakmar spat blood. "You forget what it means to bleed for the herd." He hurled his cleaver, not at Malgok, but at the base of the stone. The spell faltered. The circle broke. One of the glyphs fizzled out, its light dying like a snuffed flame. Malgok shrieked, staggering backward. Above, the vortex flared. From it descended a shape not fully formed. A massive shadow coalescing from the warp, wings unfurling, claws as long as pikes, a head like a crown of horns and serpents. A daemon prince, ancient and waiting, its form barely anchored in reality. Its presence twisted the land beneath, turning grass to teeth, stone to tongues, air to iron. Malgok raised both hands toward it. "Take me, bind with me, I offer flesh, soul, all." But the ritual had fractured. The demon's gaze, 10 eyes, endless and deep, turned to Malgok, then to Grakmar, then to the stone, and it hesitated. The bond had not been completed. The circle was no longer whole. Malgok screamed in denial and surged forward to finish the chant. Grakmar met him halfway. The two collided at the base of the Herdstone. Malgok's staff struck first, shattering Grakmar's collarbone, sending him crashing to the ground. The wargore wheezed, black blood pouring from his mouth. "You die here," Malgok snarled. Drakmar laughed, a low, wet, gurgling sound. "Not before I drag you with me." With one last motion, Grakmar rolled onto his back, and with his remaining strength, drove the haft of a broken warhorn, splintered, jagged, into the heart of the nearest glyph. The glyph exploded. The Herdstone cracked down its middle. The spell shattered like glass. The demon prince screamed, a sound that split the trees, shook the world. It began to unravel, its body crumbling into shards of warp light and howling voices, sucked back into the vortex like a soul flung into the abyss. The sky twisted in agony, and the Herdstone began to collapse inward, the weight of the broken ritual devouring itself. Malgok staggered backward, staring at the ruin of his ambition. His mouth opened. No words came, only flies. Grakmar lay dying, his face slick with gore, his eye still locked on Malgok. With his last breath, he whispered, "Let the gods feast on ashes." Then the stone imploded. A blast of raw magic, of rupture and ruin, expanded from its core, flinging corpses and trees like toys. The land cratered. The screams of the Bray shamans were the first to go silent. Then the ground swallowed the corrupted roots. Then silence. Only ash remained, and a single shattered horn, blackened and broken, lying in the mud. Chapter 9. Fire and Grail. The grove was dying, slowly, violently, and with a sound that shook the soul. The Herdstone, once a monument of blasphemy and power, now hung suspended above a chasm it had torn into the earth, tendrils of raw chaos writhing from its fractured base. Daemonic echoes lingered in the air, half-formed shrieks, gibbering laughter, whispers that bled through the trees like steam from cracked flesh. Nothing stood unwarped. Trees wept pus, roots coiled like serpents, and the ground seethed with half-buried limbs and unblinking eyes. In the midst of this festering apocalypse, Sir Calmont of the Silver Flame stood alone. His armor had been scoured to blackened steel, the fleur-de-lis melted from his chestplate by warp fire. His shield was gone, shattered in a duel against a horned behemoth now rotting somewhere in the brambles. His helm dangled from his side, cleaved in two by a demon's axe. Blood poured from a gash across his scalp, matting his hair to his skull, dripping into his right eye. His left leg buckled beneath him, the thigh bone cracked, exposed. Around him lay his men. Sir Godrich had been crushed beneath a charging minotaur, his body a ruin of plate and meat. Lady Ysandra was impaled through a broken tree, her blade still buried in the skull of a Bray chieftain she had taken with her. The men at arms were scattered, their corpses twisted, torn, and bloated. The earth drank them. Calmant collapsed to his knees at the lip of the chasm, the wind howling through the broken grove, carrying with it the stench of corruption and defeat. His sword, the silver flame, lay embedded in the dirt beside him, its light dimmed to a flicker, pulsing faintly like the dying heartbeat of a star. His breath came in shuddering gasps. "The lady," he whispered. There was no answer. He bowed his head, shame coiling around his heart like a viper. He had failed them, his knights, his men, the villagers, the land. And then something shifted. Not in the air, not in the trees, but in him. A warmth began to spread from his chest, not from flesh, not from blood, but from memory. He remembered the moment he drank from the Grail, kneeling beneath moonlight, the cup lifted to his lips by unseen hands. He remembered the taste of eternity, of stars, of sacred fire. He remembered the lady's voice, not soft, not gentle, but resolute. "So long as you stand, my light shall not falter." Calmant lifted his head. Tears mixed with blood. He reached for his sword. His fingers, broken and numb, closed around the hilt. The blade flared. Light, cold, brilliant, blinding, rushed outward in a halo. The silver flame reignited. Calmant stood. Every bone screamed. Every wound burned. His leg buckled again, but he drove the sword into the ground to hold himself upright. He turned toward the fractured Herdstone and raised his voice, not in words, but in prayer. Not for vengeance, not for mercy, but for deliverance. He invoked the Grail. The ground beneath him trembled. The wind died. Time slowed. Above him the clouds parted, not by natural means, but as if carved by divine will. A single shaft of light pierced the corruption, impossibly pure, searing through the canopy. It struck Calmant's sword and exploded outward in a blaze of radiance. The silver flame ignited into a column of fire that reached into the heavens and scorched downward. The grove caught fire, not with ordinary flame, but holy flame. It spread through the trees like truth through a lie, consuming rot, daemons, and foulness alike. Screeches erupted from the Herdstone as the spectral forms of lesser daemons writhed in agony, their forms unraveling into ash. Roots turned to dust, flesh moss shriveled. The chasm hissed as the light boiled away the warp energies within. The Herdstone itself cracked again, then split in two. With a final, shuddering groan, it imploded, not inward, but into light, its mass dissolving in a wave of radiant fury that surged across the battlefield. It swallowed everything. The bones, the filth, the blood, the rot. The very sound of the place was banished. And then, silence. Where the grove had stood was now a charred crater, still steaming, lined with white ash. The trees were blackened spires, stripped of corruption. The air was clear for the first time in weeks. The stench was gone. At the edge of it all, Sir Calmont fell. He did not scream. He did not pray. He simply fell, spent, bleeding, and empty. The silver flame, still clutched in his hand, flickered one final time, and went still. Above, the shaft of light narrowed, dimmed, and faded, but it had been enough. The Grail had answered. The darkness was broken. And for the first time in years, the Drakwald was quiet. Chapter 10. The Night Eternal. The forest no longer screamed. Its trees, once gnarled with corruption and heavy with rot, stood blackened and still, mute witnesses to a cataclysm none would ever fully comprehend. The ground where the Herdstone had once pulsed and throbbed now lay cratered, charred, silent. A single plume of smoke rose from its center, drifting skyward like the spirit of something too ancient and wicked to be killed entirely. No bird sang. No insects moved, only the wind stirred, whispering over scorched roots and the bones of two broken warherds. The Beastmen, shattered by flame and faith, had fled in all directions. Those who remained were nothing more than wounded beasts crawling through ash, blind and mewling. Many were killed by their own kin, maddened by the sudden absence of the Herdstone's influence. Others staggered deeper into the Drakwald, cursed to wander until their blood dried, or their gods remembered them. Among the survivors moved the Bretonnians. There were few. From the shining host that had followed Calmant into the woods, only 11 men-at-arms limped back into the light. Their armor was rent, their faces gray with horror, eyes wide with the 1,000-yard stare of men who had glimpsed hell and walked out the other side. Their weapons were dulled, blood-soaked, many broken. They did not speak. They did not sing of victory. They simply marched. Calmant did not walk among them. He was borne in silence on a makeshift litter of shield and pike, draped in the torn remnants of his once proud tabard. His body was broken, limbs splinted, flesh carved by battle, blood soaking the linens bound around his chest. Yet his grip never loosened on the silver flame which rested beside him like an extension of his soul. Though the blade no longer burned, its metal gleamed as if newly forged. His eyes never opened. Not once. His 3 days' march to the border, 3 days through haunted paths and silent glades where once the forest had snarled and spat and bled. They passed the bones of Beastmen torn apart by demonic backlash, found warped ruins of brace shamans who had become statues of glass or pillars of salt. The knights buried their own as they found them, Sir Godric's mace laid across his breast beneath a cairn of stone. Lady Assandra's sword planted where she had fallen, now a shrine to her final stand. At last they came to Saint-Méry. The village stood in hushed awe as the survivors returned, the peasants dropping to their knees in the mud. Children wept, old men crossed themselves. The bells of the chapel rang out not in triumph but in mourning, for the land had been saved, but at a cost, carved deep in flesh and memory. They laid Calmant in the Grail chapel, atop the altar of the lady, his sword placed across his chest. The priests, stunned by what they heard from the survivors, lit 100 candles and began the sacred rites. They spoke of visions and valor, of demons banished, of Herdstones shattered and gods defied. They proclaimed Sir Calmont of the Silver Flame a chosen of the lady, a sainted knight, a paragon of virtue. And then, the night before his entombment, he vanished. No doors were opened, no tracks were left. The sword was gone, the altar undisturbed, the air still warm from where his body had lain. Some say he was taken by the lady herself to sit among her divine host beyond the veil. Others believe he still walks the Drakwald, a silent guardian, sword in hand, hunting the remnants of chaos and purging the last stains from the soil. Children whisper tales of a silver light seen deep in the trees on moonless nights. Peasants leave offerings at old stones and shrines, where once he passed. Knights speak his name before they ride to war, the night eternal. But beneath the ruined grove, now quiet and overgrown, something lingers. Beneath the ashen root, the fractured stones of the Herdstone still lie buried, cold and dormant. Yet sometimes, when the wind is right, the soil stirs, the birds flee, the air thickens. And far below the surface, something ancient and foul pulses once more, waiting